I do think that we need to really be cynical about these commissions, these attempts to protect us, because I actually think that they will increase anti-Semitism.
Everyone is talking about anti-Semitism, but genuine, nuanced, constructive conversations about what is and what isn't are few and far between. This film documents an exchange in 2025 among a diverse group of people in Massachusetts who have thought deeply about these issues. They share a commitment to addressing anti-Semitism using an anti-racist solidarity framework, but come at the issues from different life experiences and professional backgrounds. Listen in on this exploration of anti-Semitism and its weaponization against the human rights of Palestinians and the civil rights of all Americans. How does listening to these different voices impact your own thinking? How does it affect your understanding of how to best protect Jewish and other communities? How does it influence your willingness to get involved to ensure that public policy uplifts everyone?
Hello and welcome. My name is Hussein Rashid. I am a scholar and academic that focuses on representations of religion in the media, specifically on how marginalized and minoritized religions can represent themselves better in the public sphere. I'd like to ask you all to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Jessie Daniels. I'm a professor at Hunter College, and for the last 30 years, I've been studying white supremacy in the far right, and in the last 18 months or so, have been really struck by the way that white supremacy overlaps with Zionism.
Hi, I'm Rami Khouri. I'm Palestinian American. I've been, for the last 60 years, engaging with Israelis, pro-Israeli Westerners, pro-Palestinian people all over the world on this issue of Palestine and Israel, and continue to do so as a journalist and occasionally as an academic.
Hi, my name is Chris McDonald-Dennis. I am a DEI professional and scholar. I'm also the son of a Jewish father and a Latina mother. I am a gay man. I'm also disabled. So I think a lot about how oppression shows up and is intertwined and intersectional. So for me, I'm particularly interested as a scholar of anti-Semitism to think about how do we talk about it in a way that doesn't exceptionalize it, but understanding that you really can't fight anti-Semitism unless you fight it in a shared collective liberation framework.
Hi, I'm Marjorie Feld. I'm a historian in the Boston area. I belong to a synagogue in the Boston area. And last year, I published a book on the history of American Jewish descent on Israel and Zionism. I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Peace and Concerned Jewish Faculty.
Hi, my name's Rabbi Rebecca Zimmerman-Hornstein. I'm really glad to get to be in this conversation with all of you. I'm here because I think fighting anti-Semitism and policies that help combat anti-Semitism are really of crucial importance. And as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, that's been kind of, paying attention to where anti-Semitism is rising right now, I think is really crucially important, and crucially important to do it in a way that recognizes how anti-Semitism is connected to other forms of oppression right now that are also on the rise, and how do we combat all of them to kind of move towards the society we all want to live in, one where everyone is guaranteed safety, freedom, and dignity. So excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you all again. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. My first question, Chris, I want to actually start with you because you've used both the terms anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish bias and anti-Jewish racism. Are they the same terms? Do they mean different things?
I say anti-Jewish racism because, first of all, I want to locate that often bigotry against Jews is a form of racism, even in this country where the majority of Jews are now deemed white. I also do that because anti-Semitism, so often we get into this fight about like, well, some people are Semites. Are you a Semite? It's a language. So for me, saying anti-Jewish bias and anti-Jewish racism just seems a little bit easier.
As somebody who works a lot with Islamophobia in parallel to anti-Semitism, I also prefer anti-Muslim bias or anti-Muslim racism for very many of the similar reasons. And also, I think it really focuses on actions and impacts rather than perceptions and feelings. Which isn't to say feelings aren't important or aren't valid, but in terms of how we think about what are the things we can shape our society around, it really seems to be about actions and impacts.
Yes.
I kind of feel a little of two minds on this. I completely agree with everything that Chris said, and it makes a really compelling case for using anti-Jewish racism, which I also think is totally makes sense as a clarifying term to use. And at the same time, I think that's what people are used to calling, a system of oppression targeting Jews, anti-Semitism. And so I think it has been kind of like the common language to use around it. So I think that's a reason to not dismiss it totally. And I think while it is certainly rooted in, the people who invented the term anti-Semitism were anti-Semites, and it was a eugenicist kind of term and project. And so I think kind of using it also helps like locate where anti-Semitism really comes from as we know it today. And so I think can help clarify like its roots and how we use it, which is really, in Christian Europe kind of evolved through Christian theology, and then also kind of like the material conditions Jews were facing in Europe at the time led to Jews having a certain position within European society, where they were kind of pushed into certain professions, money lending, etc., and also kind of often as the intermediary between, rulers in Europe and kind of the people who were the subjects of those rulers. And so then we're kind of in a position where they could be easily scapegoated by those rulers. And that kind of through modernity, Jews kind of became a stand-in for every problem in modernity as well. And that's where it kind of became kind of a scientific like racism.
I really appreciate what you said, because that's my analysis about, Jews, especially in Europe, playing this middle position. I also think that we see that playing out now is that where Jews have seen, and we certainly see it in this country, safety. So because of this middle position, do you look to the people in power, or do you look to the other marginalized folks? And I think that we see that. I think that many of us see powerful Jewish folks wanting to align themselves with power in this country. And that's scary at this authoritarian time. And
You talked about increasing anti-Semitism after October 7th. And I think that's true. I think there has been an increase of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish bias. But I think it goes back further. I think we're looking at about 2015, 2016, with the implicit and explicit anti-Jewish statements around the presidential election that were coming out. And I'd love to hear from you, as experts who've been watching this. Is that a fair assessment?
What I would consider to be anti-Semitism, which is, violence, hatred, discrimination against Jews for being Jews, or Jewish institutions for being Jewish for the reason of being Jews or being Jewish, is also on the rise. I think in 2023, there were over 1,000 bomb threats called into synagogues. Just in my town, Lynn, Massachusetts, where I live, there was a swastika 2 nights ago that appeared like near my house. So I do think these like instances of anti-Semitism truly like are on the rise. And I think kind of back to the historic role anti-Semitism has played, it serves a very specific function, which is to deflect blame from hardships in our society and kind of growing inequality that we're experiencing. We're in just kind of like this meta moment of major shift and kind of like collapse of a lot of the systems that we know, and that it creates a lot of insecurity for people and this growing kind of like massive rise in inequality over the last decade. So I think with that people are kind of, when people try to look for a reason for that, there's always like this tendency that's very deep, like really baked in history, to kind of create an imagine kind of like enemy from within of Jews to explain some of these massive societal shifts. And I think we've seen politicians, like especially on the right, take advantage of that, function anti-Semitism has already played, to put Jews again in this position of being like the visible face of taking away some of these rights and kind of growing authoritarianism, which I think is dangerous for us and dangerous as Jews and dangerous for everyone.
Some of us, and I will locate myself, is someone who looks at other marginalized folks. And I think that's where I always remind myself when I see my people going to places for safety that I would never go to.
And Jews around the world are paying a price because of the rising anti-Semitism, which is very clearly in part linked to what is happening in the genocide in Gaza, and resentments about how people are manipulating the media and the political system to protect Israel, which is very clear and obvious, and this generates more anti-Semitism. So it's the encounter with Western imperial colonial powers, to me, is the center point for understanding this dilemma.
As somebody who's been involved in working out Palestinian rights for many years, I hear a lot of people saying Zionism, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And several of my Jewish students have helped educate me as to what Zionism means to them and the complexities involved as to the history and meaning of Zionism. So I personally have stopped using the term Zionism. I'm critical of what the state of Israel does. Whatever the impetus is irrelevant. It feels like this is a theological question. That's not my question. But what does the state do? What is the impact of this? What do you think of that as an approach? Is it right? Is there a way to critique Zionism without critiquing Judaism?
I think too, if we look at through a more complicated lens of the history of Jews in the world, that the responses to those currents of anti-Semitism, which were, murderous at different times and dangerous, there have been a multiplicity of responses, right? Diverse responses. Zionism was one of those responses, and the appeal of a Jewish state took many different forms. So I guess I would just urge us, all of us, all the time, to think about these diverse responses and how statehood in the Middle East was one response. And even within a vision of statehood in the Middle East, there were all kinds of visions of what Israel should and might look like. So there have been American Jews and Western Jews, Jews around the world who advocated for other kinds of solutions for safety and for a different vision of what Israel might have looked like.
Is it also fair to say that in the formulation or in the period when Zionism was being formulated as a nationalist project, there were also Jews who were opposed to that as a approach to safety?
Yes, absolutely.
So this debate is not a new debate. It is
not a new
debate
debate.
since
Pre-statehood.
pre-statehood.
And indeed, in my own research, I found Jews who talked about being accused of anti-Semitism in the 30s if they took positions opposed to mainly those emerging into power, not quite yet fully power, with unqualified support for statehood the way it looks now in Israel. So I think it's really important to note these diverse responses, as you say, but also to note that a lot of Jews thought that safety could look different in the nations in which they found themselves. Safety could look like a cultural homeland in Palestine and what became Israel. Safety should not, some of these Jews articulated, some of the Jews that I look at and that we can talk about articulated that safety shouldn't mean the making of another refugee population out of Palestinians when Jews themselves were becoming refugees because of the Nazis. So I think it's, even among American Jews, if we want to locate ourselves in the borders of the United States, there were these diverse responses. And part of that conversation is about why American Jews emerging into positions of power decided on an unquestioned allegiance to Israel's statehood and to the leadership of Israel.
What I have seen happen on campuses is that there is an orchestrated effort to take the feelings and the political identification of some students on campuses and to get them to proclaim those injuries as anti-Semitism. And I think that takes us into really dangerous territory for a sort of shifting definition of anti-Semitism that then sort of aligns any critique of Israel or its practices with anti-Semitism. And that's very much baked into the the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has been used across the United States to vilify students who are, campaigning for a free Palestine, and in no way motivated by anti-Semitism. So I think it's a really contentious term right now that we have to grapple with.
Thank you a lot for that, just because I think it connects with something Rebecca said. So IRA, or IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, is one that a lot of university campuses are adopting right now, municipalities, cities, states. It's even discussion at the federal level to adopt it as a way to determine what anti-Semitism is. One of the big criticisms that actually comes from the authors, or is shared by the authors of the definition, is that it conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. We have a moment now within the last year, through 2024 and 2025, that to say Israel should not bomb hospitals is considered anti-Semitic, but a major political figure and billionaire giving a Nazi salute is not considered anti-Semitic.
We're in an environment right now where we need consistently to assert the Jewish presence in efforts for pro-Palestine, for Palestinian liberation. If we are going to attribute labels of anti-Semitism to this activism, how can we do it when so many Jews are involved in it? And I think that's the crucial point. To take an earnest reckoning of American Jewish life is to see the silencing of Jewish voices who dissent from an unqualified support for Israel and Zionism. And so that reckoning, I think we're in it right now, because never has the question of Palestinian liberation been more urgent, and never have there been more American Jews involved in the cause of Palestinian liberation, not in an equal way, right? They're coming to it with most from a set of privileges, most, not all, but I think it's a really important question. So I think we have to, for the reckoning to be successful, for American Jewish reckoning with unqualified support for Israel to be successful, I think we have to look at competing voices and competing visions. We have to think about what it means to be a Zionist today, whether or not we want to give Zionism the heavy weight of all of American Jewish identity is something that is up to us. And there are just more and more American Jews every day who don't want that equation to be viable.
And, under the IHRA definition and a transmutation of that, that actually seems to make sense. That, as a non-Jew, makes me really uncomfortable, where you can be explicitly anti-Jewish and that's not considered anti-Semitism, but criticism of a nation state is considered anti-Semitic. And so how does this chill our questions of free speech?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that this weaponization of anti-Semitism, especially on college campuses, it definitely chills speech and intellectual debate. And I think that that's actually part of the purpose of this weaponization of anti-Semitism is to tamp down any critique of the settler colonial project. And by the settler colonial project, I mean both in Israel and in the United States. I think that they're my most compassionate read of people's response to the kind of weaponization of anti-Semitism is that a lot of people are genuinely horrified and opposed to anti-Semitism, and they have a very thin amount of knowledge about this history that we're talking about. And so there's a kind of knee-jerk response, which is like, anti-Semitism bad, I'm against that, right?
Those of us who understand the need for academic inquiry and respect conversations, critical conversations about Israel and American Zionism, we need to approach it too from a complicated understanding of trauma, the Holocaust trauma, and the role that it plays in American Jews' support for Israel and for Zionism. As someone raised in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, I can tell you that the Holocaust education that I was forced to encounter as a very young person, as a very young Jew in Hebrew school, was absolutely married to an understanding that unquestioning loyalty to Israel and to Zionism was the only thing that was going to keep me as a Jewish fid safe. And so when I hear in the Anti-Semitism Commission, when I hear my colleagues, my neighbors, my friends, my family members talk about their incredible discomfort and feeling of a lack of safety around conversations about Palestine, I first try to understand it from that compassionate perspective of they have been told that this was the only thing that was going to keep Jews safe, and that they remain married to that because they can't let go of that a sort of traumatic interconnection.
There was kind of a project called the New Antisemitism to say that, you know, anti-Semitism that stemmed from Europe is no longer a problem. And like the new anti-Semitism is about criticism of Israel. And so I think there is kind of like a long history to how, you know, what we see in kind of like the current conversation that's important.
Whenever I hear about like the anti-Semitism on the left, I'm always like, well, there are all forms of oppression on the left. You know, certainly I've experienced homophobia on the left and things like, you know, as you said, sexism, classism, and things like that. Again, it's this when we exceptionalize it, anti-Semitism is just like another form of oppression. People use, and I've certainly been at, you know, pickets and, you know, marches where people have used anti-Semitic imagery, and I've had to go up to people and say, just did you know that that was a Nazi image and stuff? And people, my experience actually is people really were like, oh, I'm so sorry, I did not realize that it just, I said, of course, it's just in the air that we have, just like all forms of oppression. So I really appreciate. I also want to say about with Rami, what you were saying about what is being used at this moment to divide people. You know, we probably will talk about Christian nationalism and things like that. But one of the things that I always keep telling people is right now it feels like my father's people are being used to erode the rights of my mother's people. It's like Jews are being used. Again, this middle position, this wedge thing around safety requires that we silence DEI. And we know DEI means black and brown people who often will be seeing the images that they're seeing on their televisions and know exactly and will name what is going on in Israel and Palestine in a way that some people don't like. So one of the things I just really feel, so I care deeply about Jews, period, like full stop. I love my people, and I'm really scared about how my people are being used against.
But it's also failing. This effort is not working because the Israelis, the pro-Zionist extreme Israelis, as what I call them, for 100 years now, have pushed a series of lines and slogans that are either demonstrably false or exaggerated or diversionary, or they want to change the subject. They don't want to talk about how Israel came about, what Zionism tried to create, what happened to the Palestinians, and how as a Jewish state was proposed and accepted by the British colonial powers in a land that was 93% Palestinians, including my family in Nazareth. So these linkages are very clear. Deliberate pro-Zionist policies, not only by Israel, but pro-Zionist groups in the U.S. That have picked the campuses as one of the easy soft targets. And they're having success, but there's also immense pushback now. And this is the new element. For the first time in 100 years, we have a organized, professional, serious, and a virtuous campaign by people who seek justice for Palestinians, but also for Israelis on an equal plane, a negotiated peaceful resolution of the conflict. I've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years speaking on college campuses where I've been invited in small, big, different kind of groups. And I always seek out the Jewish students or the pro-Israeli students, as well as the pro-Palestine and Arab students. And I asked the Jewish pro-Israeli students, whether they're me and them alone or with a bigger group, I asked them, please help me understand what it is that scares you, how you feel frightened, how you feel uncomfortable, so we can do something about these issues. And what happens every time is they kind of mumble and they can't really come up with very specific, verifiable, clear incidents.
So let's take a good faith, the general movement to say Palestinian lives are important. You should not murder Palestinians. Why are people reacting to that as though that's anti-Semitic?
Many, many American Jews, I think the polling now is like 45 or 50%, are critical of Israel. And I think we see, especially among younger folks, but not exclusively among younger folks, the desire, the desperate yearning for an education in Palestinian history. You look at those encampments, and I hope that we all do, what you see, or what I see, is not rabid anti-Semitism, but a deep quest for learning about Palestine and Israel, for learning about the refugee issue, for integrating Jewish ritual, Judaism, into protest. Because I think, as we've all said, it's really important to differentiate between feeling uncomfortable with a set of knowledge that you haven't encountered before and feeling a profound lack of safety.
I think the conversation about how do we teach Palestinian studies has to be framed within the context of not only genocide but scholasticide and the murder of I've lost count of the number of journalists intentionally killed by the state of Israel. And so the idea that there could be sort of a table at which, two sides could come together equally, I think, sets aside the tremendous power dynamic that's happening and the Palestinian history that's being erased before our very eyes. As far as I know, there aren't any universities still standing in Palestine. There have been whole libraries destroyed. And so the question of how do we teach Palestinian studies, I think, is a really painful one in this moment, actually. I mean, how do you teach a history when an entire people is being wiped out along with their libraries and their knowledge and that sort of thing. So I find that actually a very painful conversation. Yeah, I just find it really difficult to talk about how we teach Palestinian history when there are no universities in Gaza. I mean, there's been an intentional effort to destroy those places and that knowledge and that history. And that is just very horrific to contemplate. And so I think we have to talk about this in that context. I also want to say that there's something about the way I have encountered Holocaust education in the United States that I think has set us up for the current moment. And now there's one curriculum, which I won't name, but if I did, you would all be familiar with it. And part of the point of this curriculum, which is widely used in schools, K through 12 schools in the United States, is to teach tolerance. That's the language of it, right? And that curriculum is really focused on the Jewish Holocaust in Europe of World War II, right? And that same curriculum used again in United States K through 12 schools does not ever mention the Holocaust we had here in the United States of lynching, which was a real reign of terror in which thousands and thousands of Black and brown people were killed outside of any kind of legal process, right? And I once asked the people who created that curriculum why they had left that out. And their answer was, not a direct quote, but was basically to say we didn't want to make school children uncomfortable with that content. And to me, that curriculum and that response to sort of excising out America's history of slaughter of ethnic and racial minorities in this country, it's really about that reinforcing whiteness and a kind of ensuring that those who are raised with the identity of whiteness have a certain kind of safety that is built on a mythology about our history in this country.
There has been this really big push to control curriculum, some of which you've talked about already. So, for example, the Massachusetts Teachers Association has resources that they've shared with their members about how to teach Palestinian history, and it's generated pushback, let's say in a mild word. How can we teach Palestinian history at whatever level in a way that is true and authentic, and is important to reveal the complexity and the nuance that's here in ways that are appropriate? Because I think we've all pretty much said ignoring that history and pretending people don't exist is actually not the way to teach it straight.
Being a DEI professional on a college campus, the truth of the matter is that many Jewish students do come unable have never heard another narrative. My concern is that there are Jewish folks who are literally willing to get rid of the things that made the United States the safest place it's ever to be a Jew, a multiracial, participatory democracy. I mean, literally being able, like getting rid of those things that actually protected us and made this such a strong Jewish community, are willing to do it because of a foreign country and because we think that we'll be safe there when we've been safe here. So I think that's the thing for me is really, really scary. I also want to talk about when you talk about the on university campuses, one of the things that I always try to do with my students is, they often were taught that certain slogans were anti-Semitic and meant death to Jews. So free Palestine, from the river to the sea.
When we say we want Palestine to be free from the river to the sea, it means all Palestinians must have the right to live in dignity, whether they're citizens of the state of Israel, or they create a new state in Palestine, or they live in Lebanon or Ohio or Japan, wherever they are, that they all must be free, not subjected to Israeli or Zionist occupation, subjugation, incarceration, torture, expulsion, etc., etc. And so these phrases are an expression of the yearning for an identity that is manifested in the homeland, in areas around the world, in a manner that is credible and real.
Too many universities have been scared, so they'll just react to it instead of being like, how do we help Jewish students experience what they're experiencing and be in a safe place where they can talk about, like, wow, I was raised that these phrases were scary and meant death to Jews. And when Jewish students who have been told that these phrases necessarily mean harm to Jews, I I want universities to be able to help those students deal with it and just to experience their feelings, no judgment because our feelings are our feelings, and but not to have the university react and to prioritize that safety because there are lots of students who feel unsafe on campuses all the time, and we want to help them contextualize it and to understand. And then if there's an action, we'll deal with it. So they do feel unsafe. Like I want to be honest about that. And I want to say that feeling of lack of safety, that inability to hear something, I have a lot of compassion for them. And I do that as someone who advises our Jewish student group, and was not raised with that narrative and that indoctrination. Everything that I've been told that is good and right in the world is being questioned.
As we talk about these diverse experiences, the political shifts, as we talk about whiteness, we're really talking about a particular group of Jews, which is Ashkenazi Jews, Eastern European Jews.
Yes.
As Chris points out, he is a Jew of color. There are significant numbers of Jews of color. There are Mizrahi Jews, and they often get left out of these conversations and will never, in discourse on whiteness, because of the way they appear, ever have that proximity to whiteness. So it feels like they're left out of really important conversations within Jewish spaces as well.
Yeah.
So there's no question that question of safety became entangled in whiteness, became entangled in safety, became entangled in exploitation. I think that one of the exciting things about the moment, if we somehow are able to bracket off genocide happening in Palestine, is the rise to power of some of these Mizrahi Jews, LGBTQ Jews. I think that we're seeing a move, really a quest for inclusion of all kinds in American Jewish communities that I find very exciting. That with the reckoning of American Jewish communal support for this country that is committing genocide that has long been an apartheid regime, we see a sort of a flowering, an upsurge, I don't know what word people would use, of different kinds of ways of approaching the question that are coming from different sort of subject positions.
Throughout Jewish history, Jews have been safest in societies that have strong protections for minorities, and have a multiracial democracy like truly is what keeps us all safe, whether here or in Israel Palestine. Like a system based on equality and freedom for everyone is historically what has kept Jews safest. And now I think we see kind of in the national context with the Trump administration, like really the cynical use of fighting anti-Semitism, of being used to detain and deport students for speech, and all of so like this kind of escalation of some of these like tendencies and some of the that we've been talking about. And I do think it truly is so cynical and really has nothing to do with protecting Jews. And I think like vast swaths of the American Jewish community see that, and I think instinctually kind of know what really keeps us safe is is living in a society where everyone's freedoms and rights are protected.
So my suggestion to whether it's a state commission, a municipal council committee, a parliamentary committee in Congress, whatever it is, anybody who's trying to look at this issue today, the first thing they have to do is make sure that they hear directly from the people involved together. But when people on both sides interact in an open, honest, fair, and compassionate environment, which can be provided by the leaders, the older people, whatever, they invariably find the middle ground. They understand that what they're afraid of, whether it's some students tell me, some Arab students say, when I see somebody with a kuppah or somebody with a kafiyeh, and the other side says, when I see that, I get worried. But when they sit together and talk about it, they realize there's nothing to worry about. And that these are people dress, they say things, they wave flags, and if they talk about these issues and understand the concerns of both sides accurately, they're almost always going to be able to find the middle ground.
One of the fundamental currents in American Jewish history is the question of representation, right? And it's fundamental to American history as well. But I think American Jews are always interrogating whether or not the most public faces of American Jewish communal life are those that speak to their realities, to their beliefs. And one of the concerns, I'll say but I think a lot of us have about anti-Semitism commissions, is that the leaders that are put forward for those commissions don't necessarily speak to the realities that we're seeing in the polling and the teachability that you're talking about, which I think is just really central.
I want to thank you all for this really fantastic conversation to help us think through how we can more intelligently and intentionally really combat anti-Jewish bias in a way that isn't reflexively pro-Israel as being pro-Jewish, and really get into what does the American Jewish community look like? How can we really engage with them in a meaningful way without jettisoning the rights of Palestinians and without encouraging other forms of discrimination, such as anti-Arab or anti-Muslim bias, to really educate and work to policy that builds our communities up rather than tears us apart. So thank you again for a wonderful conversation.